Ela foi com diz? Sim, acho que. Mas tu trabalhas com Mercedes? Há uma rapariga aqui que é um bocadinho parecida contigo, mas é só um bocadinho. Se calhar estava a fazer questão com isso, desculpa lá.
So we, yes, mainly Asian research, but with a lot of other interests, including field cricket. And we decided that this talk would be very interesting for the CIBIO audience. And John is also a wonderful naturalist, which often is not the case in so many biologists, even here in CIBIO. So I think it's a very good opportunity to listen to him in this fantastic talk. It is pretty based in a recent paper in American Naturalist this year. Okay, John, please.
Thank you. And thank all of you very much for coming out on coming in on the afternoon. Since it's such a nice day outside, it's almost better to be out rather than here. And I'll try to talk loudly enough so that you don't fall asleep, at least right away. But what I'm going to be, before I even begin to talk, though, I want to acknowledge the other people who have contributed to this project. Marlene Zook, who has been studying the biology and social behavior and sexual selection in crickets for 20 years now. And Libby Swanger, who has been doing much of the programming for the model that I'm going to be talking about today. And of course, the National Science Foundation, who provides funding so that we can actually do a lot of this work. What I'm going to talk about are alternative reproductive tactics, and they have a fairly specific name and meaning in behavioral ecology, and that's that they're discontinuous or distinct behavioral or morphological traits that represent two or more alternative ways of achieving reproductive success. In many cases, one alternative may be fixed for life, as in these beetles over here, which show two distinct morphological types, and of course, once they molt into this form, that's the form they're going to have, and each of those two different morphological types has its own way of achieving reproductive success. Or alternatively, an individual may pursue different tactics through time. And it may alternate among those tactics on timescales ranging from just a few seconds on up to most of a lifetime. These tactics arise most often in the context of intraspecific, intrasexual competition, most often males competing to mate with females, as we see in these two roughs, each of which is employing different tactics to attract females. Different tactics, as you might expect, experience different reproductive success under different environmental and demographic conditions. If one tactic somehow becomes more expensive or more costly under a particular set of conditions, then that means that there's an opportunity that can be displaced by a tactic that's less costly. Provided, of course, that that less costly tactic is also still sufficient to achieve reproductive success for the individual that practices. And that's one of the things that we're interested in, these costs and benefits that trade off and how those reach a resolution. So what I'm going to talk about today is an alternative mating tactic that involves the exploitation of sexual signals. In particular, it's something that's called satellite behavior in crickets. Two research questions that we're interested in. One is how these alternative tactics can arise even when the underlying variation in the trait is more or less continuous. The second is we want to look at the overall contribution of alternative reproductive tactics to the fitness of an organism, considering the ecological and demographic and other contexts that the organism may find itself in. I'm going to present a simple simulation model of individual behavior. We're going to look at the optimal alternative mating tactic under different environmental conditions. We're going to see when we get discrete versus continuous variation in the outcome, that is to say, when we get through alternative tactics versus simply a continuous variation in a single sort of tactic. We're going to look at the persistence of this behavior in the face of intense natural selection for another behavior. And we're also going to assess the importance of female behavior in a tactic which is actually displayed by the males. And then finally, I want to integrate the components of the simulation model in a way that allows us to evaluate the contribution of each of the individual contributors to fitness and see what each of those individual contributions are. So, we'll begin with the exploitation of sexual signals. Under sexual selection, theory tells us that sexually attractive signals usually evolve such that they become more costly to the signaler, which in most cases is a male, and at the same time more conspicuous to the receiver, usually a female. Because a signal becomes more costly through time, or if a signal becomes more costly through time, the signaler becomes increasingly vulnerable to exploitation by an individual that employs a different tactic that doesn't use that signal. That is, does not pay the costs of presenting the signal. At the same time, when a signal becomes more conspicuous, then it becomes increasingly susceptible to what we call eavesdropping, being overheard by an unintended recipient that may then exploit that signal to its own benefit. And of course, the exploitation by the eavesdropper, depending upon what that exploitation is, can drive up the cost of signaling even more than it was before. The example I'm going to use and the model we're going to build is based on fly phonotaxis to cricket song. Now, as most of you know, field crickets, the males call to attract females. If you go out in the evening on a warm summer night, you'll hear chirping, and that's a male producing a call that's trying to attract females to it. And he's in essence advertising both where he is and how attractive he might be to a female. Well, what Kate observed was that this chirping to attract females also attracted a parasitoid fly. And this fly carries with it potentially deadly consequences for the male cricket. The flies are very good at locating the calling male cricket via acoustic orientation. In fact, flies can find crickets better than crickets can find crickets. They're very well tuned to this. A female fly is attracted to a cricket. She deposits free-living larvae on or around the cricket. Those larvae climb onto the cricket, burrow into the cricket, and then proceed to consume him from the inside out. He's usually good for about 3 days. He'll continue to call, but then after that, he basically becomes a vehicle for fly larvae. After about a week, the larvae will emerge to pupate in the soil, and the cricket then actually dies, although functionally he's dead before that. So it's not a very good thing. And you can see how calling then becomes very costly to a male cricket. And this is the system that we're interested in. Well, this high cost of calling has in fact given rise to an alternative reproductive tactic, something called satellite behavior, where there are males now that are non-calling, we call them satellites. They attempt to intercept females that are attracted to the males that are calling. The satellites are often phonotactic as well, that is, they'll hear a male calling and be attracted to move towards him because that's where all the females are going. So they will often approach and settle near a calling male and try to exploit his signal. He's the one who carries the risk of parasitization, and they try to exploit that. Well, there are trade-offs between being a caller and being a satellite. The benefit to the callers, of course, is that if you think about a cricket outside, it's big out there, it's dark. How's a female going to find you? Well, you have to call. So the benefit of calling is that you attract more females, and thus you're more likely to mate the more females you attract. The cost, of course, is that you're also going to attract flies, and thus suffer higher mortality. You'll live less longer. Satellites, on the other hand, benefit from increased longevity by not attracting the flies, They're very, very rarely parasitized, or we very rarely find them parasitized in nature. But because they're not calling, they suffer reduced encounter rates with females. So that's the cost of that. So what we're interested in is how these costs and benefits for both of these tactics trade off through time, and what we might expect to see under different conditions. Now, you can think of callers and satellites as representing distinct behavioral phenotypes. One is calling, one is not. But in crickets, both of those phenotypes are expressed in the same individual. So some nights a male may call, and some nights he may not call. He may behave as a satellite. A male's propensity to call versus behave as a satellite can vary over multiple time scales. He may call during different periods within the night and otherwise behave as a satellite. He may call a lot throughout the night or very little throughout the night and behave as a satellite. He may call some nights but not call other nights. And in some cases, a male may call every night or never call at night, in which case the phenotype has become fixed. Mostly what we're going to be interested in is this right here. We're going to model males that call some nights and other nights behave as a satellite. And we're going to ask questions about what is the optimal propensity for calling on any given night. As you might imagine, the risk of parasitism is going to vary through time and space as well. The abundance of flies may vary annually. Some years more flies than others. It may vary seasonally, even weekly, daily, and even from hour to hour during the night. So a lot of variation in the risk of parasitization. So this caller satellite system in field crickets represents a situation where we have a continuously variable trait, this propensity to call from maybe no nights to many nights, overlaid on a continuously variable selection gradient. That is the risk of parasitization, which may also vary through time. And this is what we're going to investigate with using a modeling approach. We want to know under what conditions do these discrete alternatives arise from these continuously variable traits under continuously variable selection. And secondly, we're going to ask how these alternative tactics contribute to fitness in the larger context of other behavioral, demographic, and ecological variables. So the first question, how does selection in the form of parasitism risk affect satellite behavior? We're going to model individuals based on their nightly propensity to pursue one tactic or the other. That is to say, call some nights and not call others, rather than treating as a fixed lifetime tactic. And we're going to ask specifically, what propensity to call on any given night maximizes a male's reproductive success under different conditions that I'll show you shortly. So in essence, we're going to say, we'll take a population of males and we're going to ask if the probability that a male will call on any night is 30% and 70% that he will not, how does that contribute to how does that compare to a male or to a population of males where it's the opposite, they call 70% of the nights and don't call or behave as satellites 30% of the nights. Those are the sorts of contrasts we want to make. Which one of those, under which sorts of conditions, is a better strategy, a better tactic? The conditions we're going to look at, we're going to vary density of the population and the sex ratio, that is how many males and females are in the population. Sort of a demographic trait. We're going to look at background mortality rate. Crickets die for reasons other than just simply the flies. Birds eat them, centipedes eat, all sorts of things eat crickets. And so there's a risk, even if you're not mating. We're going to vary that ecological circumstance, background mortality rate. We're also going to look at the role of female behavior. We look at two components to that. One is female phonotaxis, that is, how likely is a female to approach a male when she actually hears one. And second, once she gets close enough to a male to mate, does she actually choose to mate with him or does she reject him? And those are in essence, two independent components of female mating behavior. And we want to see to what extent those play some role in determining the optimal mating strategy for a male. We're going to do all of this in an individual-based simulation modeling environment. The one that's provided by NetLogo, which if you are at all interested in the individual-based modeling, this is a perfect piece of software for doing that. It's very easy to use. In this individual-based model, each individual, in our case they're going to be individual crickets, occupies a patch in a landscape, and you specify the size of the landscape, and it can move among these patches and interact with other individuals that it encounters within the patches. The model structure is relatively straightforward. The individual behavior, whether it's calling if you're a male, moving, encountering other individuals, mating, and so forth, takes place throughout a simulated night. At the end of the night, we reckon the demographic consequences, that is, count up the number of matings, determine who lives, who dies, who got parasitized, that sort of thing. And a run ends, a simulation run ends when the last male of the initial cohort dies. The principal statistic that we collect over this is the number of females mated during a male's lifetime. And we average that over the entire initial, over all the males in the initial cohort. So every male has the opportunity to live out his full life. The behavioral rules, which govern the interactions among individuals, are also relatively simple. At the start of each night, a male decides, with, again, this probability that we set, whether to call or whether to behave as a satellite. If he is behaving as a caller, he is detectable by females over a particular radius that we specify. A female may be attracted to move towards him if she hears him or moves within that radius. He has a risk of being parasitized because he's a caller. If he's parasitized, he continues to follow the male behavioral rules for 3 more nights, and then he's removed from the population unless he dies for other reasons. If he behaves as a satellite that night, he doesn't call, he doesn't attract any females. He is phonotactic towards calling males and actually may settle nearby a calling male if he has the opportunity to do so, and he's not parasitized. Both callers and satellites can mate with a female that they encounter if she chooses to mate with him. Behavioral rules for females are also pretty simple. She is phonotactic, that is, moves towards male, or may move towards a male that she hears. She's attracted, again, with some probability to a calling male that she hears, but she may encounter a satellite while she's moving around as well. She mates with whomever she encounters, satellite or caller, with some probability, which is the same for both the caller and a satellite. Since a male can be either on different nights, he really doesn't differ from her perspective. If she decides not to mate with a particular male that she's encountered, she moves on and continues to be receptive to potentially other males. This probability of attraction towards a calling male and the probability of mating upon actually encountering a male, by which we mean she moves into a landscape patch right next to him, those are independent elements of female choosings. As I say, at night at the end of the night, we have a demographic reckoning. There is this independent, constant probability of death due to causes, in addition to any mortality associated with parasitism. And this is the same for all individuals. All individuals are equally likely to be eaten by a bird passing through the environment. So at the end of each night, individual crickets die with a particular probability and are removed from the population. Individual males that have been parasitized 3 nights earlier are removed from the population. When we remove an individual from the population through death, he or she is replaced by the same sort of individual. We do that so as to maintain a constant sex ratio and population density. Otherwise, it gets off. Although we only collect data from that initial cohort of males that we started out with, those individuals. Survivors age 1 night. If there are still any initial cohort males alive, each male decides whether to be a caller or a satellite, and a new night begins and we start the process all over. And we can do this well until we run out of computer time. This is just to give you an idea of the sort of range of values we use. We varied the density. I'm not going to talk about sex ratio. We varied density, which is just the total number of crickets in our sample, mortality, phonotaxis, the probability that a female will approach a male, and the probability that she mates with him upon encounter. Now, the way we did our initial simulations is we took this as sort of an arbitrary baseline where we held all of these values constant. And then what we would do is if we wanted to look at density, we varied density but kept the other values at their baseline. So for mortality, where for some reason we decided to try a lot of different values, we would try all of these values for mortality, but we kept density, phonotaxis, and mating at those baseline levels, so that each one of these was looked at independently of the others. That's important because we'll change that later on. But this is what we did for our initial things. Show you how or what the data looked like as we generated. We started out by varying this probability of parasitization. This is the risk that a male, if he's calling, the nightly probability of parasitization range from 0 to 0.4 in steps of 0.5. So that's along this axis here. And we picked each of these values. We set that value. And this, in essence, represents the selection gradient from an evolutionary perspective. We then crossed that variation with the nightly probability of behaving as a satellite from 0 to 1. 0 essentially never be a satellite, 1 is always be a satellite, never call. And we did that in steps of 0.1 along this particular axis. And we looked at every possible combination. And this, in essence, represents the target of this selection gradient, the thing we're interested in. And our fitness measure is basically the number of females mated in the population, or for each of the average number of males. This is what some data look like. This represents 5 runs with the density set to 50, the female to male ratio equal 1:1, equal sex ratio. This was the mortality rate, the phonotaxis rate, and the mating rate, and we end up with data that looks like this. For all of the other simulations I'm going to talk about, we ran each combination of everything 10 times. But that was too cluttered to show, so I'm just showing 5 runs here. Well, as you can see, even that's a little bit messy to look at. So what we did, in fact, to simplify that, is to fit a surface to those data. And to do that, we used locally weighted scatter plot, very hard for me to say, scatter plot smoothing, which is a non-parametric way of just simply fitting a 3-dimensional surface to 3-dimensional data. We did this instead of trying to fit a parametric equation, which, as you'll see from the shapes of some of the surfaces, would be a very difficult thing to do in any event. But this, in essence, captures the information we want, or summarizes the information we want from a number of runs for any particular combination of things. So that's what the output looks like, and now we need to analyze the output. I'm going to get the points out of the way. So the question we're going to ask, once we have this sort of data for any particular combination of things, is, let me show you that this makes sense, that the shape of that surface is actually a meaningful shape. We can look, for example, at this particular edge of the surface. This, in essence, represents no parasitism. So we see as satellite behavior increases, the number of females mated declines if there are no parasites out there. That's because not calling is costly. You don't attract females, so therefore the more you not call, that is, the more likely you are to behave as a satellite, the less likely you are to attract females, and thus the fitness of individuals who call when there are no, or who do not call when there are no parasites declines, which is certainly a reasonable outcome and the sort of thing we're expecting to see. Well, we can contrast that with high parasitization, that is where at our highest values, here calling is not a good thing because there are lots of flies out there, your risk is very high. So what we see here is that as the probability of satellite behavior increases, the curve actually begins to rise. So we now see an increase in fitness as you increase the amount of satellite behavior. Now this curve is much lower than that curve because on the nights that you are calling, you're subject to a very high risk of parasitization. So crickets don't live as long, even those that are mostly not calling. When they do call, they run a very high risk. We can also look at the other edges of this surface. This is what a population of all callers looks like. That is no probability of satellite behavior, so call every night. When probability of parasitization is 0, then it's good to be a caller. But as soon as we start having a risk, that fitness begins to decline and finally bottoms out over here. So as soon as we introduce flies into the simulated population, as soon as there's a risk, calling immediately begins to become quite the edge here. A population of all satellites all the time. In essence, this line is straight, flat. They're not influenced by parasites at all, so essentially no variation in their fitness as a function of variation in the probability of parasitization. That's pretty much what you would expect from animals that aren't parasitized. So now we're going to ask, given this sort of result, what propensity for behaving as a satellite on any given night, that is this probability of satellite behavior, what propensity for behaving as a satellite on any given night maximizes a male's reproductive success for any level of parasitization? That's the question we want to answer here. So, let's take a slice through this surface at no parasitization. So the maximum number of females mated is right up here. So that is in essence, the optimal behavior if there are no parasites, is don't be a satellite. We can continue, take another slice through this surface, now with a slight bit of parasitization, some risk. We see that although although the fitness is reduced for that level of parasitization, this is still the optimal behavior. This point is higher than any other point along that slice. We take another slice, several more slices, we see that still the optimal behavior, the highest point for each one of those slices is be a caller, don't be a satellite. Finally, at one slice, we see that, well, spending part of the time as a satellite and part of the time as a caller becomes the optimal behavior. That is to say, for this particular slice right here, the highest point on the surface is right there. We take one more slice. Now we've come all the way up to the other end here. So now the optimal behavior, the highest point on the surface for that slice is be a caller, or excuse me, be a satellite the whole time. And just to make it fast, all the rest of the slices there are going to be the highest point on the surface for each one of those slices. For each value of parasitization rate is going to be become a satellite. So what we do next is simply connect the dots, and that's sort of the optimal behavior. And we don't want to just present it like this, so what we're going to do is just simply plot the probability, the optimal probability of satellite, or the probability of satellite behavior that provides us the optimal reproduction for any given level of parasitization, and that produces a figure that looks like that, where we have the probability of parasitization here, and the probability of satellite behavior that maximizes the number of females mated. And that's how we, this is essentially the sort of data that we want to investigate further. Well, it turns out that this rather striking result, or at least we thought it was rather striking, is fairly common result, as you'll see as I go through some of the other data. Commonly, the optimal behavior switched very abruptly from being what we call a pure caller, that is, call every night, never behave as a satellite, to becoming a pure satellite, in essence, never call, as the parasitization rate increases. Now, we certainly expected that as we increased parasitization, that we would select more and more for animals that spent more and more time as a satellite than as a but we, at least initially, did not expect to see such a sharp alternative as we see here. Well, in essence, what this tells us, though, is that although we had continuous behavioral variation, this small increments in probability of behaving as a satellite, and we overlaid that on a continuous selection gradient, that is, probability of parasitization, we still get this dichotomous optimum. So, alternative reproductive tactics here. Well, let me now move to the some of the questions relating to the specific areas that I talked about. Here is variation in background mortality rate. The surface in the middle is the one that you saw before, sort of the baseline one. And this is just our lowest mortality rate and our highest mortality rate. We had several others, but it clutters up the figure. But you can see how warped these surfaces are and why we needed to use something like the non-parametric approach to creating the surface rather than trying to fit a parametric equation to it. Plus, you can also see that the surface on the top here is shaped differently than the surface on the bottom. So it was clear that one equation, no matter how complex, was unlikely to be very meaningful in describing these relationships. But anyway, for each of these surfaces, we can do the same analysis, trying to figure out for each level of parasitization, what is the optimal behavior. And this is what that looks like, where we're looking at variation in background mortality rate. Excuse me, our lowest mortality rate is here, our highest mortality rate is here, and these are the ones in between. In essence, with increasing background mortality, what we see at low mortality rates, the curve is very sharp, very dichotomous. As we increase the background mortality, it shifts this way, which is to say that continuing to call becomes more and more favored, as even under higher rates of parasitization, as background mortality rate increases. And we think what this reflects is that the mortality due to parasitism becomes a smaller fraction of the total mortality on the population. So the cost of calling versus not calling gets closer together, because the satellites are also now experiencing high mortality rates. And this seems like a reasonable interpretation. Density variation. You notice these are very differently shaped curves depending upon the particular density. And we analyze those in the same way. This is what we see with density going from our very highest densities over here to our lowest density. And what we're seeing here, as we increase the density, we decrease the satellite's cost of not attracting females, because there are already so many females out there, he can't help but run into them by chance alone. There are so many females that he just stumbles across by luck. Whereas at very low density, if he doesn't call, then it's very unlikely that he's going to encounter a female. So although calling still is very risky out here with a very high probability of parasitization, it's the only way you're going to make. if densities are very low. So at low density, you undertake the risk and you call. Female phonotaxis had somewhat less of an effect than we thought. There is a little bit, what this suggests is that if females are unlikely to approach, that is, they're not very phonotactic, then probably not a good idea to call, even if it's not very risky, because you're probably not going to attract a female anyway. So why put yourself at even more risk by doing so? And then finally, when we look at variation in female mating probability, we see that when females are eager to mate, will mate with just about anyone. We see this dichotomous behavior. However, when they're very reluctant to mate, then it pays to continue to sing even at least some part of the time, even at very, very high risk. And in essence, what we think this represents is that there's sort of a low effective female density. You need to call more simply to increase the number of encounter rates that you have with females, because they're not mating with you in most of those encounters. It's like there are fewer females out there. So we think of it as analogous to a density effect. The interesting part, as I said, was the fact that we generated this variation in this what we call a step function, this step variation, as opposed to clinal or continuous variation. That we got both, oops, too far, that we got both this step and this somewhat more continuous. Obviously there's a big kink here in the middle, but we're still getting callers out here, even with high parasitization. And really our first challenge was to figure out why this in fact was the case, why we were seeing this. And it turns out that all of the result that we've got was sort of presaged over 50 years ago with the fitness set theory by Richard Levins. And basically all it does is it depends upon the fitness of phenotypes in different environments, and we're creating different environments. It also depends upon the amount of fitness difference between phenotypes that are in the same environment, and we're certainly seeing that. And it also is determined by the frequency or the probability of different environments, or in the case of our particular model, where we are along that selection gradient of parasitization risk. So it turns out we get a step function, according to Levins's model, when the difference between alternative phenotypes in the same environment is large. And what I've done is simply taken the fitnesses of pure satellites and pure callers for the simulation where we had a density equal to 100, and that's this line right here. And you can see that there's a pretty good difference, a substantial difference between the two different alternative phenotypes, between being a satellite versus being a caller. And as Levins would predict, we see a step function. On the other hand, we tend to see clinal variation when the difference between alternative phenotypes in the same environment is smaller. And again, doing the same sort of plot here, only this time for n equals 25. We have the pure caller and the pure satellite, and what we see is that they converge and have almost the same fitness under very high rates. So there, then, at that density, we see relatively clinal variation, at least compared to the average. And the same is true for these other figures that I showed you, but this is the one to demonstrate. So what we see is that basically by changing demographic conditions like density and sex ratio or female behavior, we shift the relationship between the fitnesses of behaving as a caller versus behaving as a satellite under risk of parasitization. When we change those to push those fitnesses far apart, then we end up seeing a single tactic for any particular probability of parasitization, either caller or satellite. When we change demography or female behavior to push those closer together, we see the mixed tactics. That is, call sometimes behaves as a satellite sometimes, with the exact proportion being different. So that produces declinal variation in behavior. So in essence, what we're doing is simply, by changing demographic conditions or behavior ecology, we're changing the costs and the benefits to each of the alternative behaviors in particular ways. To sort of summarize to this point, the optimal behavior can switch abruptly between these alternative types, even along a smooth selection gradient. Although alternative reproductive tactic theory stresses the distinctness of alternative tactics, our model suggests a mechanism for how those tactics can arise, even though the underlying trait, at least initially, shows continuous variation. And thus, it may be the case that many alternative traits, or at least other alternative traits that we haven't explored, that are now discrete, perhaps arose in just this sort of fashion. Well, another question is, why does calling persist? There are lots of flies out there in lots of populations, and if you look, if you noticed, under many conditions, as we began to increase parasitization even a little bit, we saw an abrupt shift to favoring satellite behavior. So even modest parasitoid pressure under particular conditions can select for a pure satellite behavior. However, we do see a mixed strategy, that is, call some nights, be a satellite other nights, even under high parasitism risk, under particular conditions, whenever there was a high background mortality rate that pushed mortality rates closer together, lower density, where the costs of being a satellite got higher and higher, greater female phonotaxis, the more likely a female was to be attracted to a caller, the more valuable calling was, and greater female choosiness to mate, again, which we sort of interpret as a smaller effective population size for females. And the fact that there is substantial variation in these attributes within natural populations where the fly occurs, within natural population of crickets, suggests to us that it's unlikely that parasitoid pressure alone is going to yield fixation of a pure satellite strategy. That is to say, the parasites by themselves are unlikely to produce silent populations or species of crickets. Interesting was the effect of female choosiness, if you think about how that worked. When females were choosier with respect to phonotaxis, that is, less likely to go, that suggested that a male should call less as risk increased. However, as she became choosier with respect to mating to males she encountered, the opposite occurred. The male should call more as risk increased. So it depends on which form of choosiness males are subjected to as to what which way they should go in terms of the appropriate alternative tactic. Another way of thinking about this, though, is we're modeling this as a female decides to approach a male or not, sort of without really considering the fact that what she's really responding to is whether the male is attractive to her or not. So in a sense, we're manipulating male attractiveness, although we're modeling it as the change in the response of the female. It's certainly much easier for us to do so in this particular case, but really, they're ugly males in a sense, and those are the ones she chooses not to mate with. They're males with ugly songs, and those are the ones she chooses not to approach. So we can think of it in that context, and again, we still see this sort of opposite things. With respect to phonotaxis, a male with a more attractive song, that is, sounds better to females, should continue to sing even at high risk, whereas those with less attractive songs should quit singing. So we expect to see if there's a range of attractiveness of the songs of males, and we expect to see this sort of phenomenon. Whether males do this or not, we don't know. But this, in essence, is a prediction about who should be singing and who should not, even under risk. Alternatively, when we think about mating propensity, an unattractive male, that is a male who up close, once a female approaches, is not very attractive. And males, when females approach males, a male produces a courtship song. You usually don't hear it because it's much softer. It's different from the attraction song that's broadcast over, that's much louder. So he produces a little courtship song. He also has cuticular hydrocarbons on his surface that also say something about him to the female. So there is some female choice that goes on up close based on the attractiveness of the male. An unattractive male should persist in calling, even at high risk, whereas more attractive males should quit. In essence, the unattractive male needs to encounter more and more females, simply to find at least one that will mate with him. Many of us can relate to that. Okay, so that's sort of the first part of the thing, and we were very interested in how these different things influence the specific outcomes, whether calling was favored or satellite was favored, under what conditions do we see a mixture of the two. But now what we wanted to do is to look at this alternative mating strategy in a larger context. Now, as I told you at the start, we varied each of the independent variables over a wide range, but we did so holding the other independent variables at a constant value, that so-called baseline value. Moreover, we examined the effects of each of those independent variables separately. I showed you those graphs one at a time. What we now want to ask is, what is the relative weight or contribution of each of these ecological and behavioral variables to overall fitness when we consider all of them simultaneously? And that's what we're going to do next. We're going to fit together all of the components of the model into a single logical framework so we can analyze everything at once rather than just simply a variable by variable analysis. So, how do all those elements that I told you about fit together? Fit together like that. Yeah, I see some eyebrows going up. So let me, sure, this looks a little complicated, but it's actually a very simple model. So let me strip it down and then build it back up for you. This, in essence, is the core of the model. The lifespan of the crickets is very important. How long they live has a major influence on how many females they ultimately make. Both in our simulations, other people have also done modeling of this sort, and lifespan is very important. That influences the number of females encountered, which of course is very important for ultimately getting to the number of females mated. You have to encounter them before you can mate them. So we can then look at what contributes to both lifespan, encounter rate, and then mating rate in the context of our model. So we can take it lifespan. Very simply, background mortality, of course, is going to be very important in determining lifespan, as is parasitism rate. But parasitism rate is modulated, or the effect of parasitism rate on lifespan is modulated by satellite behavior. More satellite behavior, the less effect parasitism has on lifespan. The less satellite behavior, the more. So under natural selection, that is parasitism rate, satellite behavior is a very positive thing because it helps reduce parasitization, increases lifespan. Encounter rate is more complicated, obviously. First thing, let me tell you that it turns out that looking at density and sex ratio was not very intellectually informative. Both density and sex ratio, when you multiply them together, determine the number of males in the population and the number of females in the population. And really, that's what the animals are interacting with, the number of males and the number of females, not density per se or sex ratio. So, simply put, this is what we're going to keep track of as we go forward here. Satellite behavior here, rather than having a positive effect, has a negative effect. Remember, satellite behavior, these males are not calling, so their encounter rates with females are going to be reduced. They live longer, maybe, but reduced. Phonotaxis probability positively influences encounter rates. The number of females positively influences encounter rates, or so we expect. The number of males, however, negatively influences encounter rates. Males are competitors. They interfere with one another. And also in our simulations, when a female mates for the night, she's done. She doesn't mate multiply, so the more males there are, the more chance that she's already mated when she might encounter someone else. So males have a negative effect. And then finally, we have this mating probability, and that influences, once a male is encountered, a female, the final probability that he actually mates with it. So that's how it all goes together. Same figure I saw before. So it wasn't that difficult. And what we're going to do now is revisit those original simulations, only now we're going to vary the independent variables, only now including parasitism rate and satellite behavior. We're going to do this in a fully crossed factorial design, so that every value for every one of these is evaluated with every value of every other of the variables. That's going to look something like this. This is an ugly table, but what I want to show you is that we have over 16,000 combinations of values here that we needed to run from what we call ecology, that is parasitism rates, mortality rates, the male behavior, now demography, density, and sex ratio, which determine the number of males and females, phonotaxis, female behavior, phonotaxis, and mate. 16,000 combinations, 10 runs per combination. We killed millions of virtual crickets in the process of doing this. To analyze those 160,000 runs, we use structural equation modeling, which is related to path analysis, which many of you may be familiar with. It's very closely related, actually. It's multivariate, so it explicitly considers multiple variables at the same time and how they interact with one another. The standardized path coefficients that are produced yield the relative importance of the different paths and processes in the particular model. And here, our model is all geared towards telling us what most influences fitness, that is, the number of females mated. For like partial regression coefficients, it's sort of the expected impact of a change in one variable compared to changes in the other variables. It's not a partitioning of variance. It doesn't give you an R squared, although there is an overall R squared for the model, just like in a big multiple regression. In fact, this is related to multiple regression as well. So, what do these path coefficients look like? Well, here are the results. This is the total effects of each one of these variables on the number of females mated. The two biggest positive impacts on the number of females mated were, of course, the number of females. We were somewhat surprised to see that this was the largest impact, but not so surprised to see that mating probability was very important in determining the number of females mated. So those were the two biggest features of the model. The two variables have the biggest impact. The two largest negative impacts were background mortality, which we sort of expected, and also the number of males also had a relatively large negative effect. And we sort of expected those as well. Parasitism rate was not as important as background mortality rate, but still substantial and, of course, negative effect. Phonotaxis probability was much lower than we thought it was going to be. And by lower, I mean in comparison to any of these other values. We don't have sort of an independent assessment of what's big and what's small. Just that compared to mating probability, it's much lower. And we thought that it was going to be a bigger, but it's not. And then finally, the one with the lowest impact and overall negative was satellite behavior. That is this alternative, this array of alternative mating tactics that we expected to, which is why we started the project in the first place, to learn about this. But when taken in the context of everything else, the effect is both relatively small and negative. So, but that didn't stop us from moving forward. One of the things we know from all of the things that I've talked about before, that satellite behavior, or that, the degree of parasitization is important. Well, all of this is for all 4 rates of parasitization that we used in our model. We can now take out each one of those sets. For all of the 0 values of parasitization, we can analyze that. We can also analyze the 0.1, the 0.2, and the 0.3, each one of those separately, and then see how these outcomes change depending upon the intensity of parasitization. And that's what I'm going to show you now. Doesn't look like those other graphs, but let me briefly explain. What we're looking at is the total effect for each of the variables. The circles, now this is the absolute value of the effect, so we can compare the magnitude of the effects. The circles represent positive effects, like number of females, and the triangles represent negative effects, like nightly mortality. And this is for each of the 4 probabilities of parasitization. Let's just focus, let me capture your focus on just when there are no parasites in the system. This is what we see for that portion of the data. Nightly mortality has a very large negative effect, no surprise there. Along with the number of females, those are both the 2 highest in terms of absolute. Mating probability is very important. Positively, the number of males is again a strong negative effect. Satellite behavior, of course, has a strong negative effect if there are no parasites to protect the male from. Then satellite behavior is not a good thing. And phonotaxis is down here. It's not particularly important. The biggest change in any of these values comes when we go from no parasites to some parasites. That is our lowest level that actually included risk to see. Biggest change, of course, is that the contribution of nightly mortality drops considerably. It's now less of a factor. The satellite behavior, although the magnitude changes, the magnitude is smaller, it's now less negative than it was. So it's still slightly negative at this parasitization rate, but it's not this bad as it was. And the rest of these, certainly the number of females becomes more important, mating probability. This changes, our phonotaxis changes slightly, the number of males hardly changes at all in terms of effect. Once we get beyond that point, just looking at everything else, most everything else doesn't change too much. Sort of once we get past a critical value of parasitization, at least in this model structure, then everything is more or less the same, although the good news is, from our research perspective, the satellite behavior is now positive. It is making a positive contribution to fitness, and again, as we increase the rate even more, it goes up. But everything else is more or less flat, and there's not a lot of change here. And still, satellite behavior in the total perspective of at least this model framework and the things that we're considering is still a relatively small component of what influences the number of females mated in this model population. Well, to simply wrap up here, we certainly know that there are conditions, that is to say particular combinations of those variables that I've been talking about, where satellite behavior makes a very strong, positive contribution to fitness. However, overall, this presence of alternative reproductive tactics has a negative effect on the number of females mated, particularly if there is no parasitization. And even so, variation in those other variables appears to be more important. The propensity for satellite behavior has to change a lot in order to compensate for even a much smaller change in, say, the number of females mated, one of the most important aspects. What this large effect size of female mating probability and numbers of females and so forth essentially implies a relatively strong a strong selection on male attractiveness. And satellite males, for everything else about them, they're just not attractive because they're not producing a song. What we conclude from this is that quite likely that sexual selection is probably a stronger element, at least in this model system, than natural selection induced by the parasites. And so our next, and what this suggests to us is the next things we ought to be doing in the real systems from which we've abstracted this information to try and think about, we should be looking at male attractiveness and female choice. That's going to be more important than how much the male sings during any particular night. And with that, I want to thank you very much for listening to me when it's such a nice day outside. Or you could be asleep. Thank you very much. I don't know if there's time for questions, but otherwise I'll be around and happy to answer any questions about this or anything else.
I have a question. Okay. May I? Okay. What about if what's the probability of non-telling crickets to be president? So if a non-telling cricket could be present for change?
Oh yeah, in real life, the non-calling crickets that we've examined are not parasitized. It's possible that simply and females are not parasitized except at very, very low rates, and it's possible that for both a satellite or female to be parasitized, if they happen to be close to a calling male when he's parasitized. We consider that part of the background mortality for those, because they're not parasitized because they're calling. It's an accident, so to speak. So that really contributes to their background. Somebody else?
At first, I didn't understand really, because in that graphic, let's say, you have mating probability. It means that not every female that males encounter, they are able to mate, let's say. What kind of factors, do you have an idea, can change this value of probability?
Well, I think that's one of the things we need to look at more closely. We know that there are female preferences for courtship, elements of the courtship song. The courtship, the advertising call is relatively easy to analyze because it tends to be very repetitious, and you can measure it's pretty simple. The courtship songs tend to be slightly more complex, so it's more of a multivariate thing. And for different species, you see different elements of the song seem to be important in terms of what a female prefers to mate with. The thing that people are looking at now a lot is these cuticular hydrocarbons, which seem to convey some information about the quality, for lack of a better term, of the male. And there again, we don't know exactly what it is about them that what information a female is getting out of it, except that there are certain combinations that are preferred and certain combinations that are not. We have colleagues, particularly in Australia, who are very much interested in trying to determine sort of the physiology, if you will, of these hydrocarbons and why a female prefers them. beyond that, there's not much else to choose amongst. I don't think there are any visual aspects to the male. I think it's mostly the quality of the courtship song and maybe his behavioral interaction with her. They antonate one another, and there's some, but other than that, I don't know. But it's important that we look at it.
I was thinking of a couple of things as I heard the talk. One of them was in this last step where you try to give relative importances to the different factors. I was wondering whether that depends on the range, on the numerical range of variation that we decide to put on each variable. But I'm not sure this is a smart question because I don't understand the equation modeling.
Yeah, to some degree it would, but because about all I can say really is that for some variables it's either 0 or 1. That's the range. So we can't move beyond those limits for a number of the variables. For things like mortality, we have more scope for variation. I don't think that's I don't think that's an issue. The easiest thing for me to say is that the range that we used in the second, for this modeling, was within the range that we used in the initial results. So we sort of took the maximum and minimum from our first work and used that for the second work. For some of these variables, as I say, they can only range from 0 to 1. Like parasitism rate could potentially go higher, but the crickets don't live long enough then. And that sort of reaches, it's almost like it has a natural plateau. The number of males and number of females, the results begin to asymptote. So increasing the range is probably not going to do much. So I understand the question, but I don't think it's a problem.
And probably you showed biologically sensible.
Yeah, well, we tried.
The second thing I started to think about was, as you were explaining this network of connections. So the last brown box, so female might, that's fitness. But before you also explained that different types of females, those that are more phenotypic, less phenotypic, more choosy, less choosy, make different selection pressures on males. So yes. I was thinking if you put a loop back, rather than treating females as a variable that you decide the number, if you put, because then females will pass their genes together with the genes of the males that they select, and different types of females will select different types of males as you show. So do you think there's scope for one loop back from also considering the female fitness and the fitness of each type of female summits?
No, we and some other, we've explored some alternative I've presented the satellite behavior as this thing that a male chooses to do. There's also a different alternative reproductive state, which has a genetic basis, and we have tried to model a feedback into that. In essence, a dynamic evolutionary thing. That turns out to be very difficult. And also, at least for the one that we tried, was very unstable. We couldn't get it to stabilize. But no, it's in a sense what we're trying to do is just take static snapshots and sort of predict what would happen were we to include that feedback loop. In other words, let the population evolve. Yes. What we're doing here is in essence predicting the direction that it should evolve. Were we to add those loops. But no, I think that's a very good suggestion. And as I say, we've tried a loop from females mated back to satellite behavior where we had a different thing other than satellite behavior. But we couldn't make it work. But I think that's what we'd really like to do, is have an evolutionary dynamic model to see if, for example, does it cycle through time, or does it stabilize, or do we get to, persistence of two different morphs, those sorts of things. I think it would be very interesting to do. But right now, I don't have the skills to do that. I'll ask Libby to. That's what she does next. Thank you very much for coming.